Hey there, everybody, and welcome back from networking. Hope you had a chance to meet some really awesome people in there. We'll have another opportunity for networking a little bit later after this session. And then also just a reminder, our friends at Carpenter Wellington will be in their booth from 12 to 1 to take any questions that you have regarding legal concerns or anything else you really want to chat with them about. They're there for you. So stop on by and talk to them. The link, I believe, is pinned in the chat, though I can't see it. So somebody else will confirm that in the chat. All right, and with that, really excited about our next session, which is ethics and AI. And to introduce our panelists and to guide you through it is Christy Post, who is the Senior Director of Creative Partnerships and Brand Experiences at Hypergiant. Christy, welcome to the stage.
Hi, thank you, everyone. I'm so excited to be here. You know, Austin Startup Week is definitely something we want to be a part of because Hypergiant is a 2-year-old startup here based in Austin, Texas. Our offices, when we are in the office, is at 6th and Congress. So let me tell you a little bit about Hypergiant. We are an emerging technology company focused on developing AI technology to solve the world's biggest problems in the areas of space, defense, and critical infrastructure. And Hypergiant Industries offers a suite of AI services, software, and hardware that support companies and governments in preparing the future through data. So we're really excited to put together this panel today. It is on ethics and AI. You know, AI faces growing concerns about its applications and use, which have led to increased calls for regulation. And with the potential issues and concerns around its misuse becoming increasingly prevalent, we're exploring how do you approach regulation, policy, and ethics really to create a better world. So we have 2 panelists here. I'm super excited to introduce them. We have Will Griffin, our Chief Ethics Officer at Hypergiant. We also have Sherri Greenberg. She is the Professor of Practice in the LBJ School of Public Affairs and the Director of Research for Good Systems, the Future of Work at UT. So we put together this panel because we're involved in ethics and AI, and then the UT Good Systems is as well, and Sherri's a part of that. So if both of you just want to take a couple minutes to introduce yourself, and we'll get this fireside chat started.
You first, Sherri.
All right, I'll go first. Thank you so much. I am very excited to be with you today. This is, as was noted, a very important and emerging area, ethics in AI. I am a professor of practice at the LBJ School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas at Austin. And I focus on technology policy, finance, state and local issues, including issues such as ethics and the digital divide. And my background is spanning several. This is not my first career, but it's now my longest, and we can talk about that more. I do bleed orange if you go down there, and I went to graduate school at London School of Economics.
Thank you, Sherri. I'm originally from Austin, Texas. I went to LBJ High School. I was in the first class of what's now known as LASA, or it was called the Science Academy back then. I'm an entrepreneur, would really be kind of how I characterize myself in my present role. I'm a Chief Ethics Officer at Hypergiant. It's a startup founded by Ben Lamb. This is his 5th startup. We're a team full of people who've worked in startups or entrepreneurial ventures before, and we're excited about the work that we're doing. I went to law school, worked on Wall Street, Hollywood, dabbled in a bunch of ethically questionable industries. So I've seen all the wars and all the issues. So I'm very excited about being in the ethics practice now and being here today with Sherri and Christy and being part of Austin Startup Week. So with that, I think we can just kind of get into it. So Sherri, first off, thank you for being here today. I'm excited to talk to you. Obviously, you're one of the leaders, in the country, really, on public policy in tech, and you advise at the federal, state, and local levels. But I always like to start by helping our audience get a better sense of the background, which is like, where'd you grow up? And then how did you work your way into public policy in the current career?
Okay. I grew up on the outskirts of Oklahoma City. Yes, this is a fact. And I did not grow up in a family of folks who were involved in public policy or government. In fact, they were all business people. But I did grow up in a family that was involved in the community and that had lively extended family dinner table discussions. When I was 17, I came to the University of Texas at Austin for undergraduate school, and I thought I was going to be a research biologist. Yes, that's what I thought. Obviously, that's not where I ended up. And you mentioned Wall Street, which is interesting because I actually, after I went to London School of Economics for graduate school, started my career at Standard & Poor's on Wall Street doing municipal bond ratings. Yeah. And that's what began to spark my interest, really. I ended up there because of one sentence I read in a book in graduate school. And I thought, well, this combines my interests, finance and policy and whatnot. And then after 4 years at Standard & Poor's, we moved to Austin and I became capital finance manager of the city of Austin. And from there, my life took a turn that I didn't necessarily expect, but I became a member of the Texas House of Representatives. So I was elected from a district here in Travis County, served there for 10 years, and then began my career at the LBJ School at University of Texas. So what's the common thread? I think there are several. One actually is technology. I've always been interested in science and technology. And another is combining both research and people. I realized when I was 17 that I probably wasn't cut out to spend my whole life in a lab. I liked people too much, but I also liked research. And so that was my path.
Wow, that's a very, very, very fast. And what I like about it is the range, which kind of shows the intellectual curiosity, the multidisciplinary experience, and in a lot of those areas, we're cutting edge. I mean, S&P, when you're rating municipal bonds, like when you're doing, I mean, that was the cutting edge of finance at the time. So now you're the research chair for UT Good Systems. And
for the future of work, which is one of the research areas, yes, of UT Good Systems.
Yeah, exactly. So if you could talk a little bit about that role, about UT Good Systems, and then abstract it more broadly, like what role does higher education have to play in the future of ethics and AI?
Absolutely. So Good Systems is one of the grand challenges that was initiated by President Fenves when he was at UT. And it is such a wonderful opportunity. It brings together interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary researchers from all over the UT campus to really explore and provide guidance on AI and what is a good system. How can we use AI for good? Right. And so it is very interdisciplinary. And this year, which is the second year, we have some specific research areas, focus areas. And the one that I'm heading up is future of work, which we know is so important when we consider not just AI, but what has happened in the world recently and in our ongoing situation with COVID-19. We also, besides doing research, have various opportunities to interact with the public and speaking engagements. But there are probably at least 24 research efforts underway right now, different research efforts. I am right now involved in one that I am the director of, which is looking at artificial intelligence and people experiencing homelessness. And how do we use AI and big data and predictive analytics to see if someone is experiencing homeless somewhere in what I call the homelessness continuum. Not everyone experiences homelessness in the same way. And then also to use AI, again, with data and looking at the services that nonprofits and government, local governments and others are providing to try to better match services for people who are experiencing homelessness. That's just one example. With the future of work, of course, we will be exploring and researching what does work mean today, and how does that intersect with AI?
And then when we look at, so that's at UT and Grand Challenge, which I think is pretty unique among universities in the country, particularly among the American Association of Research Universities. What do you see as the broader role for higher education in the future for ethics and AI?
I think it's significant. I had an opportunity over the past couple of years to be engaged in a research project that was funded by Cisco out of their foundation out of California with a colleague of mine in the School of Information, again, interdisciplinary. And through that research, we conducted interviews with 3 different sets of people, researchers who were actually developing AI, not just within academia, but in industry. And then policymakers, whether they're elected or appointed, who are in charge of policies and potential regulations regarding AI. And then lawyers, perhaps such as yourself, who are involved in the legal aspects. And one of the things that we found from all of them is when we asked them, did your education prepare you for this? I think 99.9% of them said no. No. Right. So I think that higher ed needs to be providing that kind of direction and that kind of education and developing the curriculum for folks starting in undergraduate school all the way through PhDs, and also providing that training and education and curriculum for people who are in industry, who are in government and nonprofits. So a big role. Right.
And then I want to make sure that the people who are watching know that you can start submitting your questions now as you think of them, and then we'll get to them, towards the middle or towards the end when we get to the Q&A time, because I'm sure you're going to have a lot of questions. Now, talk about the multidisciplinary role. What I have learned, in my time working in tech and specifically at Hypergiant, is that they speak engineers, R&D, machine learning, data scientists have a lingua franca, a nomenclature that they're used to speaking in, whether it's defining things as use cases or talking about their process of Agile or the working in Scrums. And I think I found it very helpful to be able to speak the same language that they're speaking, and then we can talk about how we can implement ethics in the workflow. So when you look at the role of higher ed, so in law for a couple hundred years, there's been ethics in values, professional responsibility in the discipline. Business school probably started 30 or 40 years ago in earnest, teaching leadership and values. And obviously medicine, since the days of Descartes in the 1500s, it's really in Hippocratic Oath, it's really been a big part of their discipline. But in engineering and computer science, they don't really have that same type of training within their discipline. So kind of from where you sit in the School of Public Affairs, are you finding that you're going over to the Department of Computer Science and Mechanical Engineering? Now I'm guest lecturing in Karen Langholt's behavioral ethics class, but are you finding that you're going over there, or they're coming over to you and they're saying, how can you help us embed values or ethics into our curriculum?
Absolutely. And the research that I've done and the curriculum that I will be working on and proposing is completely interdisciplinary. No. And what I am proposing is that this curriculum, as I said, start with undergraduates and go through PhDs, and then it be across campus, and then it be interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary, with having students from the different disciplines in a class together, with having it co-taught, right? And so this is extremely important because, again, from the research that I did over the past couple of years and the interviews that we conducted, we found exactly what you're saying to be true, that the policymakers didn't really understand the language of the engineers and computer scientists, and the engineering and computer scientists really didn't understand the policy issues, and that there was a lot of, well, I don't know that that's within my realm. No, this is within everyone's realm. Ethics and AI. This AI is everywhere in our lives now, whether we realize it or not, and that will only continue. And so it's important that we have this, as I said, multidisciplinary, not just from the standpoint of, faculty and people teaching, but in the classroom, that the students be from the different disciplines.
Right. Well, that's an exciting field of research, obviously, and one very necessary. And Austin is known for its startup culture, startup ecosystem, whether it's Silicon Hills or the companies that spin off of Dell, or all the way back to the original IC squared incubators. Like Austin is very
and Sematech and MCC, right?
And MCC, exactly. So Austin is very, and now we have with Tesla moving in, other bigger companies in California are moving in to kind of validate and propel us forward. But given that in the startup world, in the startup culture, how do we get ethics in AI embedded at a startup level and to become part of the ecosystem?
You need to be proactive. Ethics is not something that you can come in and layer on as like, a cherry on top at the end, right? Ethics needs to be baked into the batter from the beginning. So with a startup, this needs to be part of the startup mentality, that as we are starting up, as we are looking at, just like you look at your financing, right? Your strategic planning, all of these aspects, what is our ethical platform and foundation, right? And how does this fit in? So it has to be baked in from the very beginning, as I said, just as your financial strategy would be and your other strategies.
And then I think, given your experience at S&P, and that was when I worked at Goldman Sachs. Like that's the whole game,
right?
Especially the fixed income side. You want to get the AAA rating. You want to get the investment. You're trying to get the investment grade rating. Well, at the moment within AI and even within the startup ecosystem, there is no third party rating system that can vouch for, other than personal relationships, that can vouch for the trustworthiness of an entrepreneur or of a startup, or the trustworthiness of the products or the solutions that they're building. So what can be created, or what can be used as a S&P style rough proxy to evaluate companies and products and services for ethics in AI?
This is a really good question, because we have lots of governments, whether it's at the federal level or state or local governments, cities exploring this right now. And of course, many companies, from startups to your major corporations. And this is something else that I'm beginning research on, and that is, can we come up with standards, right? You have NIST and you have some of these other national standards. So is there a way to bring together people from different levels, from different disciplines, to come up with some type of national standards when we're talking about AI and what is ethical behavior?
And so, as part of that, you're a board member of the Austin Smart City Alliance. You've been an advisor to Mayor Adler. You've been an advisor at the government level, and you've been a public servant yourself, an elected public official in the state body. So when you look at all those different levels of government and an advisor at the federal level too. So when you look at all those different levels, from your point of view, who's in the best position to actually create those standards, and who actually has the hammer you need to enforce those standards, whether it's startup companies or larger companies or whoever it is that deploys AI into the marketplace?
Well, when you say hammer, that's an interesting word, because really you get into what's between a policy and a regulation. If you have an actual regulation at the federal or the state or local level, there is some type of hammer. You have a statute, a regulation, and if you don't do this, there'll be a fine or other aspects that could be more severe. With a policy, you're saying, these are the standards and this is what you should be doing. So that is the first level of question. And you can have both policies and regulations, right, at any level of government. But I think that is something we need to consider. What should be regulations versus policies? Okay. And I think all of this needs to be considered by a multidisciplinary, private, nonprofit, public sector, and academic type of commission or board, right, that brings together people from all levels of government also.
Now, and do we have that?
We do not, but I am hoping we will.
Is the city of Austin prepared? Is the state of Texas prepared? Is the federal government prepared? Like, who has the expertise? Like when I was in our, when I first started my career and I was in mortgage-backed and asset-backed securities.
Right.
The reality, and it was unregulated. It's very similar to AI now. Like the
Yes.
financial engineering is ahead of the regulators by a long shot. In fact,
Right.
I was there in the early and mid 90s, and it wasn't until the crash of 2008 and the regulation of 2009 before there was even any regulation on mortgage-backed and asset-backed securities.
Right.
And so AI is moving at a much faster pace. So I really do wonder, like, who at what level are they equipped, and who is going to equip them, and what type of talent do you need within the government for them to exercise that policy-making role, whether it's regulation or just policy?
Right. And, this is something that it's not just the United States that we're grappling with, whether you look at the UK or Australia or the EU. It is something that we all are. Right now, I do see people and places, whether, as I said, it's the EU or here in the United States, there are local governments that are looking at how do we implement AI and networking, cities networking. There are certainly people in industry, as I said, from startups to the major corporations who now are looking at this, and there are various levels of government. But I do think that it is that we do need to bring everybody together, that we're reaching that point. And it has to be talent from all of these. It has to be talent from public, private, nonprofit sectors, from academia. It has to be talent from the different disciplines, whether it's a lawyer, public policy, people who have expertise actually developing algorithms, computer scientists.
And I know that you're in high demand for your consulting and for your research services, and you've worked with public and private entities. So I know there's probably limits to what you can actually disclose, but who in a calm situation, but who's doing a good job, of policy on a government level, and then B, on self-governance, on private governance and self-regulation as corporate entities?
So I think that we are seeing some of the major corporations now actually focusing on that. And I'm looking to see what they're devising, but that gives me some real hope that the business sector is focusing on it. When I see major corporations, and there are quite a few that actually have divisions, have people who are responsible for this and are promulgating standards. I also see some startups that are doing that. And I do see some local governments some cities who are now beginning to focus on how do we implement AI and what is ethical at the beginning stages of that, as well as some federal agencies that are looking at that, and some states. So I see these nooks and crannies across where people are doing this.
And then recently, there's some high profile examples that we see, like with the Black Lives Matter protesting leading to facial recognition bans by different law enforcement entities. And we saw IBM.
And what we've seen in San Francisco, for instance, was the first city. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So what do you think about with San Francisco or Sacramento and, other cities now that are starting to ban governmental use of facial recognition? What do you think about that?
Well, I think that this is something that's been of concern to quite a few people for some time, but it didn't necessarily come to the forefront until we saw the really outpouring of support and the protests against what has become and what is the systemic racism, the disparities and inequities. That brought it to the forefront. But we have seen for quite a few years now that there were real problems with facial recognition. When we're looking at AI, as you well know, and when we're looking at algorithms, AI is only as good as what you're inputting. And one of the big issues has been bias, right? Whether it's bias in algorithms or when you look at facial recognition, bias in how that is developed and then how AI is learning from that. So these are real issues and issues that we need to consider, and that we are with good systems. How are we developing AI for good, right?
Absolutely. And so now that question was something that came from the audience, and then Christy has more questions who came from the people who are listening today. But thank you very much, Sherri. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you both. It's been a very lively conversation, and we have a lot of questions from the audience. So one comes from Tim, and he said, is there a need for an AI certification of fairness, inclusiveness, non-discriminatory? And he said, should it be administered by an underwriter's lab or a neutral entity? I know we covered this a little bit, but he's going into the certification. What do you think?
You know, whether or not there is an actual certification, I do think there need to be standards. So let's take hiring, right? We have seen that there were a lot of companies that jumped on the AI bandwagon for hiring. You know, we're going to, when all of these resumes come in, AI is going to just sort them out and determine who we're going to interview. And we saw that there was a lot of bias, frankly, with that. And some companies have abandoned it. And so I do think that there are real fairness and equity issues. And it may be that at some point there's some type of standard or certification for people in, for instance, HR and human resources, just to throw one out, to make sure that what they're doing in their hiring with the use of AI meets the standard of fairness and equity.
Yeah, and Tim, I think that's a great question, because that's kind of what, you know, Sherri and I were, you know, kind of talking about. It's like, who's responsible at the end of the day, you know, whether it's regulatory entity, as corporation, or et cetera. But I also, whatever regulatory regime or policy regime we come up with, I think that the burden of proof needs to be on the use case owner or the product creator and the designers. The burden of proof can't be on the private citizen to try to catch you doing something wrong. There needs to be. So the reason why I like your idea of some third party or a neutral entity or certification process is because that puts the burden of proof on the designer and the developer to affirmatively state, we have vetted this ethically and we certify to you, the public, or the rest of our stakeholders, that it meets the criteria that was set. That would be the central piece, irrespective of how the mechanism or the organization or entity.
Right. And I agree with that. And we see a lot of that. You know, if you want to be an architect, a doctor, I mean, there's a lot of certification we see of people's professions. We were talking about finance. There's the Government Finance Officers Association. There's various certificates you would be to be a certified financial planner for people in their personal finances. So this is a standard that we see across agencies. For human resources managers, there are already certifications that you can get. Absolutely.
Yeah, and on the product liability side, for cars to go on the road, for bridges to be put in, they have to be inspected and certified. So, and I feel like because most AI use cases are an apex technology that has such broad impact on so many people, that there are products and services that rise to that level that do require that extra burden of proof before.
Well, there are. And again, in the research I was doing the past couple of years, one of the use cases, as you said, we must look to these individual use cases, whether it's facial recognition or hiring or who's on a transplant list, right? But another one is autonomous vehicles. And one of the big issues that comes up with that is liability, right? Right now you have your insurance and that covers liability. Well, what happens with autonomous vehicles? The liability issues are big.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think this brings us to our next question that Bill asked. So he's wondering, should there be someone within the data team, within the engineering team, that has responsibilities over ethical considerations? So Will, your position is very new, a chief ethics officer, and that's what your position is. But do you think that should be standardized across the board?
I do. Yes. I certainly do. And this is one of the things, again, we found in our research that for a lot of people, they didn't have the training in their own educations, whether they were policymakers or engineers or computer scientists, and they felt like that was lacking and they need it. But also, in some situations, there was just this lack of knowledge and responsibility. Well, does that pertain to me? I don't know that that pertains to me in my job at this company. And so I do think that this is something that we need, and we need it across the board. We need it in companies, we need it in governments, and more we are seeing this position. Absolutely.
And I mean, Christy, you already know this, but what I try to do is, as opposed to compliance, where there's the general counsel, there's deputy general counsels, and you need to be very well versed in the laws, the potential litigation that comes from compliance programs. With ethics, my role is to train the R&D, data scientists, the developers, and the designers to implement an ethics and AI framework into their workflows, where they
Right.
are empowered with another set of tools that should make them creative, make them more creative, should make them more powerful, and should make them be able to envision a larger group of stakeholders that they have responsibility to, and it should help them design and develop solutions that are more robust. So my goal is always to give them a framework and put it in their hands as a tool as they develop and design the AI, so that they can't say that there was some outside entity like compliance who's responsible for what they do in oversight them. But no, the responsibility is yours. It's in your hand to embed ethics into your portion of the workflow, into the use case. That's always my goal, to make sure I can evangelize within the company. And then fortunately, we have a CEO, as Christy knows, Ben Lamb, who actually requires all of our solutions to be vetted by our ethical framework. So now it's just part of the workflow.
And that's when we were talking about it needs to be baked in from the beginning, right? This is not some kind of afterthought. It's not somebody else's responsibility. That no matter where you are in the process, there are repercussions. There are ethical repercussions. Your use case can either be inclusive or exclusive as far as people and the general population, and that it's not just someone else's responsibility. That, oh, I don't need to think about bias. Yes, you do. You need to think about it from the very beginning.
Absolutely.
And I think that brings us to the last question. So we had someone ask about bias. So there's gender and there's racial bias, but how do we ensure that these data sets used to train AI are fair and balanced?
That is a really, really important question, because again, the algorithms are only as good as what is input as far as the data and the bias. So, an example that I have used actually for years in my classroom was, if you talk about hiring police officers, right? And if what you have is a situation where traditionally your police officers, let's just say, were white males who were 6'2", right? And you have this algorithm and it goes off of that, then when applications come in for your new cadet class, anyone who doesn't fit a white male who's 6'2" is not going to be reviewed for being part of that cadet class. That is an example of, the type of bias that you can see in algorithms and how they're used.
Yeah, and Sherri's making the great point, which is to say that if you are in an industry or you have a use case that has historical bias in it, the burden of proof is on you to prove that you don't have historical bias in your data. Because all that happens with AI or algorithms or machine learning or neural networks is it gives whatever the data is a superpower to essentially become more of what it is already. So if the data is biased, then that only amplifies it into the future. How do you fix that? Well, now it becomes more about your creative imagination. Well, in this particular set of data, this data is not great. But there are other use cases, whether it's around the country, in other industries, other analogs around the world, where you can now then take that data and then apply it to or overlay it to the data that you have. Or you can bake into the algorithm a correction for the historical biases. But in order for that to happen, you have to start with your own framework and your own ethical values, and you vet your data by that first.
First,
and if it
you have to recognize it. Yes, the first step is what you're saying. You have to recognize it. And then whether you are in a startup and you're looking at applications for your particular product, right? And there can be bias in that, and your assumptions of who's going to use it and how, that would be another. Then you have to recognize that from the beginning. As you said, you can bring in other data from all over to auto-correct for that.
Absolutely. And you have to, it has to be intentional.
Absolutely.
The process is very intentional. You can't assume that you're starting with perfect data. That would be a wrong assumption.
I don't know that there is such a thing as perfect data. I've never seen it. It can be very messy. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So I said that was our last question, but we got another one. So I think he brings up a good point. There's all these silos out there. We're evangelizing AI. We're talking about the need for this, but how do you get Austin organizations who are focusing on this, or even just have it part of their company like ours, or global AI organizations, the government? How do we get everyone together on the same page, and where do we go from the evangelism to action?
Mm-hmm. I think that there are opportunities. For instance, the City of Austin has various boards and commissions, and one that deals with telecommunications. There are other venues such as, and I happen to be on the advisory board, full disclosure, Austin Forum on Technology and Society. But we may have reached the point here locally where we could, in fact, form some type of roundtable, right, of individuals from the different sectors and disciplines to focus on this locally. I think that would be a great idea.
And if I'm a startup, honestly, and I have a son now who's doing public affairs, and it's a very heavy data intensive program with data science and whatnot. And I tell him, like, for the next 20, 30 years, the intersection of tech and ethics are going to define and reshape the social compact of all of the stakeholders. And if I was a startup, we kind of are in a startup, but if I'm in the startup ecosystem, I would really put ethics at the forefront of the products and services that I developed. And whether you consider these to be mundane use cases or whether you consider these to be innovative use cases, if you bake ethics into your products and services now as a startup, the goodwill value created for you, your company, and your reputation will last you a lifetime.
That's a great point, because from an economic standpoint in the private sector, and again, I grew up in a business family, right? We've seen this for years with some thoughts to the triple bottom line and social investing, but this is the triple bottom line of ethics in AI in your company. The triple bottom line doesn't have to just be financial and social investing. I think this is part of a new triple bottom line. And I think it's incumbent upon all of us, right, as consumers, whether we're consumers of government or of nonprofit services, or we're consumers of products, we can demand this, and the markets will respond, whether it's your local governments, or, as I said, a nonprofit, or the free market will respond with industry.
Absolutely. And if you're a startup, it's a competitive advantage for you. Right. It's a way to distinguish yourself, because at the founding stage, when you get your early stage or initial capital, that's one group of investors, and they're becoming much more aware of ethics and values. The reason why is because at the top of their food chain in the venture capital and private equity world are institutional investors. Institutional investors are now adopting a set of principles, the ESG principles, environmental, social governance principles, essentially value principles, which say that they will only invest in firms that in turn require their investments in portfolio companies to adhere to a set of values and ethical standards. So you're already ahead of the game. If you come in with your business plan, if you're early stage, you already have your ethics and AI, ethics and tech vetting process, because now you're speaking the language that venture capital initially, and as you grow, private equity eventually, and if you go public, institutional investors all want to hear, which is that you operate your business in a way that conforms to these ESG principles.
And
so it was huge.
Yeah, I think this really is the evolution of that triple bottom line, what we saw with consumers and even employees demanding, and at one time it was, environmental and social good. And we have seen this evolve now with, as you said, investors and institutional investors looking for companies, whether they're startups or whether you then get to those institutional investors that have this embedded. You see people who want to invest their personal funds, or as institutional investors, their funds in companies as part of their portfolios that adhere to these ethical standards.
And when we talk about standards, the World Economic Forum has their AI toolkit for the board of directors. Is there someone that you all go to look at those standards like the World Economic Forum, or is there other resources that people can take away after this conversation to do a little bit of research?
Well, I think the World Economic Forum is doing kind of what Sherri alluded to before, and what one of the questions asked, which is, who is the consortium who's trying to bring together all of the different values and principles and ways of operationalizing. So the World Economic Forum, obviously, and they put their stuff out there. Toolkit for Boards is Firth Butterfield. That team are doing great work. So Toolkit for Boards, Toolkit for the C-suite. Another group that I think is doing a good job is the Berkman Klein Center for Internet Society at Harvard. They have the Principled AI Project, where they're actually cataloging on an ongoing basis public entities, private corporations, and their governance in their standards that they put out. The EU is a leader in this area, but the OECD has put out a publicly listed set of standards. But I think if you start out with the World Economic Forum and you go to the Harvard, the Principled AI Project, you'll be able to see them having put together pretty much most major corporations, large private statements. On the small company side, that becomes a little bit more challenging of who's actually operationalizing it. I mean, you can kind of look up Hypergiant. We put our stuff out there freely. At Hypergiant TV, you can go see all of our discussions and seminars with some of the people that I'm talking about, and then you can go look at Sherri's work, which is available. She can tell you where at the LBJ School of Public Affairs. That's all publicly out there. And I know you have more research that's coming out now. Right.
Yes, you can look at Good Systems EU, but those were the same. The EU, the World Economic Forum, the Berkman Center were some of the same that I was going to note as places to go to that have published information on this. But there is more and more coming out all the time. Good Systems at UT, we are doing more work on this. And there's some papers that I published from the research that I was alluding to that we did with the funding that we received from Cisco. There's research going on with all across campus at UT and with Good Systems. So there's a lot more out there, and you will see more emerging over the next year.
Well, I just want to thank you both. Thank you, Will and Sherri, for having an excellent fireside chat on AI ethics. It's definitely an important conversation, especially in the state we're in right now in 2020, when a lot of people are working on this technology, and it's really going to be a game changer in how we do the technology, and what ethics and policies we have behind it is very important. So thank you again, and we hope to share this recording once we get it. And thank you all for attending.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Awesome. Thank you so much to our panelists. Christy, thank you so much for moderating and bringing them together. Will and Sherri, pleasure meeting you guys, and look forward to seeing you around.
All right. Thank you.
All right. And for everybody who's tuned into the stream today, remember, there are lots of different ways that you can plug into Austin Startup Week. We have a networking session that's coming up here in just a minute. I do want to point out, in Hopin on the left side, there are booths in there. If you have questions for some of our sponsors from our hosts, I know they would be eager to meet with you. Carpenter Wellington has a booth on the left side of Hopin that you can pop into, as well as St. Edward's, Friday Health Plans. There's even a help desk in there. So if you get lost or you have questions, you've got somebody to point you in the right direction. We have lots of really great sessions coming up later today. I know I'm excited to hear about some of the awesome ones. I'd have to give a shout out to the Sales and Biz Dev track host, Erica Isett. She's great. You should go and check that out. Right now, though, hop into networking over on the left side of your screen. Click on that and go and meet some of your fellow attendees.